In 2015, massive amounts of oil were discovered off the coast of Guyana, with the potential to transform this country. But the story of Guyana is winding and often dark. This video will look at the history of Guyana since independence, and how one man, mostly while the rest of the world wasn't watching, managed to turn it into his own tropical dictatorship. This video looks at the years of Linden Forbes Burnham. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. To briefly sum up how we got here in the story, from the 17th century until soon after World War II, Guyana was a European colony, first of the Dutch and then the British. The economy for almost all of this period was dominated by sugar, and to this end they imported hundreds of thousands of African slaves, with the Amerindians pushed to the interior. When the British abolished the slave trade, they replaced African labour with labour from British India, bringing a few 100,000 indentured servants to Guyana. Due to all this, when the British were ready to let their colony go in 1964, Indo-Guyanese were the largest proportion of the population at 47%, Afro-Guyanese 32%, and Amerindians only 4.5%, with mixed-race people making up most of the rest. In the years before independence, the British introduced a certain amount of self-rule, which soon fractured along these ethnic lines, primarily between Afro-Guyanese and Indo-Guyanese. And because the Indo-Guyanese were the largest group, their political party, the PPP, led by Chedi Jagan, kept dominating elections. The problem for the British and the Americans was that Jagan was on the left and starting to worry them. This was the height of the Cold War, so the British and Americans pulled some strings to install the rival Afro-Guyanese political party, the PNC, into office, led by Linden Forbes Burnham. And he is the main character in this story. But now, with peace of mind, the British were finally ready to let British Guyana go. At the point of independence, 80% of Guyana's export earnings were controlled by just 3 British companies. That's where the profits went, and where the technical and managerial expertise came from. The people of Guyana provided only labour. Indeed, in the words of historian Charles Mann, they were punished if they tried to do anything else. Distant owners had little interest in building up the institutions necessary for complex societies, schools, infrastructure, or a native bureaucracy. Guyana was first and foremost an extractive economy. The young country had only one university, a night school that had been established only 3 years before independence, and it got off to a rocky start. In 1962, Venezuela had announced that it was rejecting the boundary between the two countries that had been agreed on with the British in 1899, and 4 years later seized the Guyanese half of Ankoko Island in the Kuyuni River. Small, poor Guyana could do nothing about it. So Burnham and the PNC were now in sole charge of the country, and some pretty dodgy elections followed. In 1968, for example, they won an implausible 93.7% of the overseas vote. When an independent body based in London investigated, they found 2 horses, a closed butcher's shop, and a railway among the registered voters. The thing had been rigged. Now Burnham began to turn the machinery of state into an instrument of the PNC. He gerrymandered electoral districts and politicized the civil service. He passed a National Security Act, allowing for unrestricted search and seizure, and for individuals to be detained without trial. It was necessary because with the Indo-Guyanese almost half the population, his mostly Afro-Guyanese PNC would never have been able to win a fair election. At this stage, the Americans still loved him, as he had renounced his Marxism. Guyana was the perfect former colony. In 1969, they became a republic. A year later, they became a cooperative republic, whatever that meant. But having been helped into power by British and American fears of communism, he now swung hard to the left, announcing he would lead Guyana to socialism, and immediately started organizing the country into cooperatives. Burnham promised he would make a small man into a real man. He recognized communist China and nationalized all the sugar and all the mines. He pursued a relationship with North Korea. He allowed Cuban planes to refuel in Guyana on their way to fight in the Angolan Civil War. This wasn't what the Americans had planned, and they pulled out. to be replaced by the North Koreans. I'm wary of confusing Afro-Guyanese with African, because of course they're not the same, but now Burnham really was orienting his entire government towards Africa. He visited several African countries and tried to involve himself as much as possible in the African liberation movements of the 1970s, sending an admittedly pitiful amount of aid to the liberation movement in Mozambique. He sent more than 100 Guyanese public servants to work for the Zambian government, and badly needed doctors, engineers, and lawyers were dispatched across southern Africa. This from a country in which Afro-Guyanese weren't even the biggest ethnic group. Burnham suspended the constitution and announced that from now on every public building would fly the flag of the PNC, and every military officer had to swear allegiance to it. The army absorbed a sixth of the government budget and became almost entirely Afro-Guyanese. Guyana, already poor, slid into destitution. The postal service stopped working, as did the buses, and public infrastructure crumbled. The economy ground to a standstill. And at the same time, Burnham banned the import of food. He said potatoes and wheat were tools of the capitalist West. Now nothing could be imported. There were no alarm clocks or spare parts for motor vehicles, and there was a black market in lipstick and aspirin. By 1979, the private sector's share of the economy had plummeted to only 10%. The stuff that there was needed to be smuggled in from Suriname, and with the smuggled cars and parts came drugs and guns. So people started to leave. In the years immediately following independence, immigration was mild. In the first 8 years of Burnham's presidency, 22,000 people left. But then, in just the next 4 years, 28,000 fled the country. Those are actually big numbers in a country of some 600,000 people. But this was a trickle, which soon became a torrent. Since independence until the present day, around a quarter of Guyanese have left the country. And, in the middle of all this, Guyana would face its own little insurrection. A rebellion not in the cities or towns or even the jungle. It was down on the grasslands, the savannah. And one morning I left Georgetown, heading south through the forest, to find out what happened.
There is one single road that runs through Guyana connecting the population centres of the coast with the southern grasslands known as the Rupununi, and the first leg of the journey was to take a bus to Linden. Stopping for fuel is a reminder that Guyana has one of the highest homicide rates in the world.
Sleepy Diaper is the #1 selling diaper brand in Guyana because it's all natural and organic, with very high absorption levels and leak-proof barriers.
Linden is a mining town, known as the gateway to the interior. Right next to Linden is a gigantic bauxite mine. It's the last town of any size before the jungle starts. I was traveling with my friend Dan, and we walked into town to find something to eat. From then on, we would be hitchhiking. We started waiting for rides at about 8:30 in the morning. We didn't get our first ride until almost midday.
I'm gonna tell you that I love you 100 times a day.
Linden, as it happens, is also the end of the tarmac. It's all dirt between here and the Brazil border. Everything back from the coast is simply called the interior. People go off into the interior to find gold, and often find malaria. And to serve them in the tiny gold and lumber towns is a small army of prostitutes. Many of them, like the workers themselves, are illegal migrants from Brazil and Venezuela. We were dropped in Mabura about 4 hours later. All the rides had passed and we were told the traffic wouldn't start again until midnight. We thought we were in for a long wait, and were about to settle in at the lone restaurant when another van zipped by, hurrying to catch the last ferry of the day across the Essequibo, some hours away.
I need you every day.
We drove like it was Formula One. We might just make it after all.
I want to let you know, oh, you're the only one for me. No one
That night I saw snakes, parades of ants, and an armadillo crossing the road, though I didn't catch any on camera. Our driver missed the ferry, but Dan and I weren't crossing. Instead, we would be staying for a couple of nights in accommodation unlike any other I had stayed in.
I really hope you love me too.
You have toilet paper?
Yeah, we got some toilet paper.
Michelle's Island sits in the middle of the mighty Essequibo, Guyana's biggest river, and the third largest in all of South America. I don't think I've slept anywhere nicer. For some $20 each per night, we had the island completely to ourselves. The first thing across the river the next morning was the first ferry at 6. We washed our clothes and then got ready for a full day of river life. At this time of year, the river is at its highest, submerging forest on either side. With Pius, who runs the shop as well as the rooms on the island with his wife Michelle, we went exploring Kurupukari, the indigenous village on the banks of the river, and looking for howler monkeys.
Wild cashew.
We bought petrol for the boat and were shown how they still hunt for game in the jungle.
This leopard? This is very dangerous. When it goes, the punch left.
So, but like this one is good for like a big animal.
Big animal, yeah, tapir, deer, peccary, even jaguar. They're big animal.
We were also joined by Donna, who comes from a village way upriver, but works at a nearby eco lodge, who came with us fishing. To fish, we needed bait, which was quite the process.
We're supposed to have a tiny hole where they went in. This one would be they already gone out. Fish, we got pick our bass.
With the bait secured, we had some lunch, then had to rush back to the island to take in our washing while it rained. Then it was back on the river to fish. On the coast, they drink Guyanese beer, but from everywhere south of the Essequibo, the beer is Brazilian.
Oh, look, I've got a scorpion.
Oh shit! There's a little scorpion on his leg.
Leg?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh!
We didn't catch much, though we did see spider monkeys swinging in the trees. And then we found our howlers. At least our two friends here got something. Life in the rainforest is dictated by the weather, and we just about escaped a downpour. We hid and played pool and drank more beer. Then Donna had a football game to play, and they let me join in one of the wettest football games I've ever played in.
Why is he just hanging out with the fish and stuff?
The next morning we were up at dawn to cross the Essequibo one last time. That afternoon we would be finding what we were searching for.
Daddy, are we moving?
We found a ride with a guy from the coast who was driving down to visit his girlfriend, working as a nurse on the Brazil border. South of the Essequibo, the road is even worse and cut through by rivers. Around midday, we got stuck, along with almost everyone else.
This feels not even on the ground anymore.
Some solutions work better than others. People took turns at running the gauntlet. What was impressive was the ethic of solidarity. Nobody was allowed to leave until everyone was through the mud. Then, emerging out of the jungle, we reached the Rupununi, a giant grassland the size of Scotland, separated from the rest of Guyana's population by hundreds of miles of thick jungle. And scattered throughout this expanse are only a few tens of thousands of people. No European even settled here until 1860, hundreds of years after they arrived on the coast. It remained isolated like this, weeks of paddling or walking from the coast, until the age of the aeroplane. It has one town, Lethem, serving an area the size of Britain. This is Guyana's frontier, a world so distant and so different from life on the coast.
For the ranchers down here, many of whom were white, the Afrocentric government in Georgetown was cheating their candidates in the elections. Added to that, for the Amerindian people of Guyana, Burnham had been talking about distributing land to Afro-Guyanese, land that they felt was theirs. So the ranchers, cowboys, and many of the Rupununi's indigenous people banded together. They were led by a woman named Valerie Hart, an Amerindian leader from the Wapishana. But who would support them? Well, this is where we need to talk about Guyana's border disputes, and particularly with Venezuela. It's complicated, but it goes back a few hundred years to land that Venezuela claimed against the Netherlands, back when Guyana was Dutch, and then against Britain, who had taken Guyana from the Dutch. In brief, in 1835, British maps showed British Guyana's western boundary at the Orinoco, Venezuelan maps at the Essequibo. They couldn't settle it, and both agreed not to actually occupy it. until gold was discovered, and so immediately the British moved in. Venezuela protested, but Britain was strong. What could they do? The Venezuelans appealed to the Americans, who forced the British into arbitration in 1897, but the British sneakily bribed the Russian member of the tribunal to vote for them, and the tribunal awarded 94% of the territory to Britain, which meant, once it became independent 70 years later, to Guyana. Venezuela didn't let it go. They took the opportunity of the inaugural Assembly of the United Nations in 1945 to denounce it. There have been times when it has even looked like they were going to invade. I mentioned before, for example, how in 1966, when Guyana became independent, Venezuela forcibly occupied Coco Island. This still rumbles on. In 2004, Hugo Chavez said he considered the issue finished, but then in 2013, the Venezuelans detained a ship doing oil exploration on behalf of the Guyanese government. But it doesn't look good for Venezuela. Guyana, in a sense, had inherited this problem from the British, not created it themselves. Now, instead of weak Venezuela being pushed around by the might of the UK, the poor and small Guyana was being bullied by the much larger Venezuela. The optics aren't good. Plus, I think everyone understands, what, is Venezuela just going to take 2/3 of Guyana? Land which Guyana has occupied since it was independent, an independence that Venezuela has itself recognized? But long story short, Venezuela claims all of this, and Venezuelan school children to this day are taught that much of Guyana is theirs, an area larger than Greece and rich in minerals. On December 3rd, 2023, Venezuela held a referendum over the region, asking citizens to vote on establishing a state on the area they call the Essequibo, and whether to grant citizenship to anyone born in the area, as well as to whether to reject the jurisdiction of the UN's top court. Venezuelans voted in favor, but as of now, the situation is stable. This isn't the only dispute, by the way. Suriname also claims a slice down in the southeast of the country. In 1967, Surinamese surveyors had to be forcibly removed and shots were fired. Guyana agreed to remove its military from the area and then just never did. Anyway, going back to 1968, and Venezuela still claimed the entire area, including the Rupununi. So on Christmas Eve, the Rupununi rebels were flown to Venezuela, armed with weapons, renamed the Army of Guyana Essequibo, and flown back. They had promised Venezuela control over their new country on the Rupununi in exchange for assistance in the rebellion. A week later, the insurrection began. The rebels took control of public buildings and airports and took hostages. I read a few different things, but it wasn't a bloodbath. I've read 1 policeman was killed, and I've read 5 were. They spread out across the savannah and declared independence. Hart was declared first president of the Essequibo Free State and immediately requested Venezuelan protection. The Rupununi was now a republic. But the Venezuelans didn't show up. A day later, it was all over. The Guyanese government flew down troops from Georgetown and the rebels fled. Venezuela offered them a home where they were granted birthright citizenship on account of being born in what they considered Venezuelan territory. The Guyanese army took back control of the Rupununi, and eventually the government released everyone who was detained, except for the leaders who were hiding in Venezuela. But for years, it was illegal for anyone living in the Rupununi to have an aircraft, and many of the indigenous population of the Rupununi took refuge in Brazil and Venezuela and never came back. When it came down to it, Venezuela didn't back the insurrection, and the rebels were left to themselves. Valerie Hart would die in 2021 in Florida. While the rebellion wasn't massive, it did show the underlying tensions within Guyana and the danger of what Burnham was doing, governing for one community alone, as well as the ongoing marginalization of Guyana's indigenous peoples. But Burnham continued his own cultural revolution. The goal was for this little country of much less than 1 million citizens to be completely self-sufficient. In the 1978 election, there were 10% more people on the electoral roll than the United Nations estimated for the total number of eligible voters. In a referendum on a new constitution, the government won with 96.9% of the vote. Guyana, ignored by the world, was becoming a little tropical dictatorship. But soon the eyes of the world would be on Guyana, and for an unexpected reason. In fact, it was probably the most famous moment in all of Guyana's history.
Jonestown is so beautiful. Jonestown is so beautiful.
It starts in 1931 in the United States with the birth of a man named Jim Jones. By the age of 22, he has established a church of his own, which he calls the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. The cult grows, amassing over $10 million. He has sex with his church members, both male and female, keeping it all on film as blackmail. One day, he is caught at the back of a Hollywood theater with a male undercover agent for the LAPD and charged with lewd conduct. By 1977, California is getting unwelcoming, and Jones, trailing allegations, decides it is time to move. With the temple's wealth, he buys 27,000 acres of pristine jungle in Guyana. It's the perfect country, isolated from the world and poor, with plenty of corrupt officials who will do anything for money, or a night with one of his teenage congregants. Over 900 believers will follow him to Georgetown, get on boats, and sail up the coast. They include Vietnam vets, hippies, a woman who escaped the Nazi death camps, and a former CBS television presenter. From their Georgetown base, the temple sends some of their attractive girls to the beds of local politicians to help assure their compliance, and they order guns and cyanide. For Burnham, this is great. Not only was the temple bringing its money, but they were willing to live where no one else was, in the northwest. Remember, this is the part of Guyana that Venezuela claimed. Would they dare invade if in their path were 1,000 vulnerable American citizens? So there would be Jonestown, a plantation of religious slaves. This would be Jones's theocracy, in which people are beaten and starved and punished with sex. The day ends at midnight and begins again at 3. Children are taken away from their parents. Nobody can escape because nobody knows where they are, and their passports have been taken away. Jones broadcasts over the radio for 6 hours a day with loudspeakers out in the fields. There are white nights which they practice over and over, in which every person drinks a cup of colored fluid. But now, back in the States, people are getting suspicious. In 1978, US embassy officials pay 4 visits to Jonestown but find nothing wrong. Then a representative from Congress called Leo Ryan flies down. He is shown around, and then suddenly people are begging him to take them with him. They drive to the airfield at Port Kaituma. There, a group of temple men catch up with them, and they start shooting. Ryan is shot dead, along with 3 journalists. Back at Jonestown, the story was reaching its climax.
I got a hell of a lot of weapons to fight. I got my claws, I got cutlasses, I got guns, I got dynamite, I got a hell of a lot to fight. I'll fight.
Jones called everybody together. This would be the final white night. Flavor Aid, tranquilizers, and chemicals had been mixed together and poured into little cups, and all of it was recorded, and it survives.
This is a revolutionary suicide. This is not a self-destructive suicide. So they'll pay for this. They brought this upon us. We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide protesting the conditions of an inhumane world.
First the children drank, then the adults. Those that disobeyed were dragged to the ground and injected with it. They died still wearing their shoes. There were 909 dead, including 276 children. They killed the dogs and cows and even Mr. Muggs, the pet chimpanzee. The ambassador of Guyana in Washington soon discovered that his lover, who was mother of his child, had actually been planted in his life by the temple, and she had been secretly recording their most intimate moments. He killed both her and their daughter, then shot himself. It was all over. Most of the bodies were packed onto planes and sent back to the US. Only a small handful survived. But the thing is, this video isn't about the Jonestown massacre. It's about Guyana. And how much of a Guyana story was this? Many see this as being fundamentally an American story, or perhaps a story about the long death of the 1960s. For Guyana, this doesn't fit into some theme or narrative in Guyana's history. It's both Guyana's most famous moment and its most forgotten. But that's not to say it didn't matter. For those moments, the eyes of the world were on Guyana. To the outside world, was Burnham really the great liberator, or just a despot from the swamps? Burnham had allowed the People's Temple to move in and had accommodated them. For many in the government, Jonestown was a perfect cooperative socialist community. The fact that they openly carried weapons implied approval from the government's inner circle. In 1979, a fire destroyed a stash of government records, including communications with the temple. With Jonestown, Burnham's hold over the country began to weaken. 1979 ground on violently, with the education minister being mysteriously shot to death, then opposition socialist leader Walter Rodney killed with a car bomb. Wasn't Burnham a socialist himself? 35,000 people attended the funeral and protests came in from across the global socialist community. It was looking more and more like Burnham was just a thuggish dictator. His prestige in the so-called Third World began to crumble. Burnham won another crooked election in 1980 and installed himself as an executive president, but now the economics were clearly against him. Guyana was simply unable to export enough bauxite, rice, or sugar to finance its imports. Public services collapsed, and there were blackouts and shortages of rice and sugar, both of which were produced in the country. Burnham's race-based socialism, in which Afro-Guyanese held all the levers of the economy, was failing. People continued to flee overseas, and Guyana's population actually shrunk throughout the 1980s.
Defense is our duty, love is our duty, discipline is our duty, creation is our duty, as the black freedom fighters of Africa and America.
And then suddenly he was gone. In 1985, Linden Forbes Burnham died during throat surgery, performed by Cuban doctors. Apparently, he died because of a lack of antibiotics. He was 62 years old.
Linden Forbes Sampson Burnham, the man, is no more, but his work lives on.
The Burnham years were over. Guyana had accumulated massive debts, and between 1973 and 1993 had experienced exactly zero economic growth. It was poor and it was divided. And yet, little did it know that its fortunes were about to change, if only it could sort itself out. The next video is about Guyana today.
For years, Guyana has been either forgotten or ignored by the rest of the world.
A spiral of racial violence is strangling the country.
Guyana, South America.
A South American nation on the cusp of a remarkable transformation.
The reason? Oil. Vast reserves of the stuff.
Since oil was discovered here in 2015, 1/3 of all the new oil found in the world has been off the Guyana coast.
I think it will go down as one of the best deep water developments in the history of the industry.
Enough to turn one of South America's poorest countries into one of the richest.
But while this story is one of extraordinary promise, it's not without its challenges.
It will intensify the ethnic problem.
You've seen a huge escalation in terms of inequality.
Does that give you the right to lecture us on climate change? I am going to lecture you on climate change.
Concerns of corruption and organized crime.
The world is trying to move away from oil. Do you feel at all like you're in a race against time here?
Yes, it's a race against time, but we intend to accelerate.
Attorney General Basil Williams asserted that the 2020 elections in Guyana was the most fraudulent in the country's history.
Venezuela is carrying out a major troop buildup on the border of Guyana,
as Venezuela threatens to annex more than half of the country of Guyana.
We absolutely stand by our unwavering support for Guyana's sovereignty.
The country's story serves as a reminder of the complex interplay between geopolitics, resources, and the pursuit of prosperity.
We intend for it not only to be a blessing, but for it to be an important tool in the building of a prosperous Guyana and a sustainable Guyana that can finally fulfill all of its potential.
Back in Annai, the gateway to the Rupununi, Dan and I had an afternoon to spend exploring the village. The village is mostly indigenous Guyanese, and the pace of life down here is a lot slower.
Sour sop juice, pepper pot beef.
Do you need any pepper?
We saw the monkey, it was real. He told me there was a monkey and we found it.
When we were dropped off in Annai, we inquired at the first house about somewhere to eat, and the man there said we could hang our hammocks at his place. Adam, from the Makushi people, was one of the nicest people we met on our travels in the Guianas.
There's one They're fast. Doesn't have time to run.
He gave us as many mangoes as we could eat, from all the different types that he grew.
Do they come? This is lovely.
So juicy. Everyone got a mango. Adam also showed us his garden that he planted himself.
You take the bitter, the poisonous cassava, make the cassava bread, and then the gazric, the tapioca, and stuff. When we take the juice, the poisonous juice, to cook our food, and we eat it, it's more delicious than anything else. We have done it for centuries and myriads of years, and nothing happened to it. Banana, peppers, which is very important for the Amerindian. These are the hot peppers. These are not sweet peppers. And these cassava at the back here, they are the sweet cassava. There's a little jungle here. There are different types of potatoes, right?
Is this this looks kind of like peanut. Is this peanut?
Yes, peanuts. Yes. The pumpkins. You have other peppers.
Other peppers.
Yeah. Pawpaw, bananas, corn, more cassava, and we use it as for medicine. It's bitter, but it's
This one here.
Yeah. Let me demonstrate. It's a bed for making a bed for cassava stems. Eggplant this way. So bananas. This is apple banana. Hayari. We take that skin off, mix it with some water. We put it into a creek or a pool of where there's fish, and the fish gets stunned.
Stunned, yeah.
Stunned,
Wow.
and then we can catch them.
Blow it up.
In the next video, we will look at Guyana today, its challenges and its choices.